juro. So many books, Victoria. I mean.
I know.
So how are you? I mean, you're back in Spain on a promotional tour. How are you feeling?
I'm good. It's almost the end of the year, so I feel like I'm trying to get to the point where I can exhale and I can hibernate and I can eat. And so I started the long process of asking myself what I would need to do to come back, what I would need to justify to myself to come back. And so I knew I wanted to write a new series set in the same world. I wanted it to have old characters and new characters, kind of a passing off of the torch. And I did not want it to feel like simply a continuation of the Shades of Magic series. It needed to feel like its own thing, its own motive. And so it took a few years, which is why there's a gap in between. And it's long because we're covering the 7 years in between the two series as well, because 7 years have passed since the end of Conjuring of Light. But most of all, it felt like coming home.
Okay. Let's talk about this because I got like many questions. I mean, I have got many questions.
Yes.
Can people read independently this one from the trilogy, the main trilogy?
You can. I mean, here's the thing. As someone who wrote it in this order,
yeah.
I will always feel a little personally like if you can, you should start here. But I also worked very hard to make this a possible beginning. So you can look at this as a book 4, or you can look at this as a book 1.
Okay.
And my goal is that one day, when all 6 are out, you will be able to decide whether you want to read this arc first or this arc first. So you should feel very welcome. The goal was, in between these two series, I wrote Addie LaRue and I wrote Gallant, and I want new readers who found me through those books to feel welcome to begin the journey here.
Chicos, en resumidas cuentas, no hay excusa para no leer alguna de las dos series. Tienen 2 opciones para empezar. Algunos que no conozcan todavía Una magia más oscura pueden empezar por aquí. Pero ya ven que esta pregunta, que tenemos como 20.000 por día, se pueden leer de manera independiente sin ningún problema. And now we are going to talk about that gap in the middle. That's, I mean, we can physical gaps.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they are material now. What can you tell us? I mean, let's talk first about Addie LaRue, that probably was one of your biggest books in terms of like massive around the world.
Yeah.
How was that feeling when, because we have followed you very closely during all the writing process. I mean, I remember when you wrote the last sentence, the post on Instagram about it.
Yeah.
So how do you feel now, like a few years after Addie and the book being read all over the world?
I think it's into every single thing that I write, and then to have a book that felt that special to me do what Addie LaRue has done for my audience. It's in 30-something countries and it's brought millions of readers in. I don't look at it, I can't see any of my books independently of all my other books. So I am so grateful for Addie LaRue because it brought new readers in to the house that I'm building and welcomed them in. And so I love it for what it is, but I also love it for making people feel welcome. I love it for bringing people who don't think they like fantasy into fantasy, because Addie LaRue is a fantasy novel. People say it's a literary novel or a historical novel. It is a deal with the devil. It is an immortality tale. It is a fantasy novel. And it's really fun to write fantasy books with a capital F and then a fantasy with a lowercase f and show readers that fantasy isn't just
fantasy, but it could be like a new door for them, like to discover the fantasy literature.
Exactly. I've always tried to be the kind of writer who is accessible, who writes for people who don't think they like something. I want to convert you. I want to be your gateway drug into these genres. And so I think even for Just Shades of Magic, I tried really hard to make fantasy and magic feel grounded and accessible and very inviting, because when I was growing up, fantasy didn't necessarily feel that way to me. I didn't see myself in it. I certainly didn't see myself centered in it. It felt like you had to prove that you deserved to be there. So already Shades of Magic and Threads of Power are works that I tried very hard to make feel accessible. And then with Addie, I do see it as this way to kind of wedge the door open and say, oh, you liked this thing, now sit with the fact that it is fantasy. And you've just said that you don't like fantasy or that you don't feel welcome here, but you felt welcome in this. And why is that? And I think a lot of it has to do with who's being centered. The fact is that historically, when we think of a fantasy novel, we think of a very specific kind of hero, a very specific kind of lens through which the story is told. We think of dragons and swords, and we think of certain things that, so often, it's not that they don't interest women, it's that women very rarely see themselves portrayed as the center instead of the love interest, instead of the side quest. And I think showing stories that can center women and be fantasy, or center non-binary people, or center queer people, or center...
And people out.
Yeah.
So, for me, that's something important because
I feel like whatever you're going through, it feels personal. So when you're struggling creatively, you see it as a failing of you, and not a fact that the system is hard, that creating is hard. So I started out, and the rule for myself was that I was going to be accessible on social media, and I was going to do it so that if anyone else was struggling as a writer, if anyone else was just coming up, no matter where I was in my journey, they would see that there wasn't a big distance between us, that I sat down every day and struggled with the same imposter syndrome and the same doubts and the same creative hurdles that they did. So accessibility in that sense has always been really important to me. And then I think it's also just a way to feel less lonely with readers. It's a way to connect with readers. It's a way to hear from readers. I think it's always been really important to my sanity to get illustrations. But again, it's not for kids. Has a found object inside of it. It is a mystery, and it is a found family story, and it is a horror, and it is a haunted house tale. So I wanted to write, and then I never would have been allowed to do early. The only chance I was going to have to write exactly what I wanted to write because people would publish it. And I had this conversation with my US editor, wherein I said, I think this might be too weird, and she said, after Addie LaRue, if it has your name on it, we'll publish it. Which was, you have to understand, a level of creative freedom that I did not have early in my career. My first book was taken out of print less than 2 years after it came out. My next 2 books were meant to be a trilogy, and they were canceled by the publisher because I didn't have strong enough sales. I was blamed by the publisher for not having strong enough sales. Like, things were not going well. So I do not take for granted what an incredible luxury it is to have a publisher say to me, if it has your name on it, we will publish it. And I think that if you don't take success, market success, publishing success, and translate it into ambition, I don't see the point. Like, if you take market success, this is the thing I needed it down to my bones, and those are the people that I'm writing for. So the more books I write, the less my books are for everyone, but they're for someone.
That makes sense. And it's interesting, especially now that we are going through different waves of different trends.
Yeah.
So how do you handle, when you start writing a book and knowing the market, knowing the trends that are out there?
I don't care about trends. I don't care about the market. I don't care about trends. They are the meanest critic that I have, because there's this little goblin.
That's inspiring, and that is a good lesson for everyone trying to write a book, because this is something very common that usually when you get manuscript in a publishing house, they are like trying to follow the rules, the stuff that are selling now.
But there's a gap.
Stuff change very fast.
Well, Addie LaRue is a perfect example of this. I did not think about the context in which Addie LaRue would come out, would hit shelves, while I was writing it, because it took 10 years. So the trends, everything about the market changed. What happened was Addie LaRue happened to hit shelves 6 months into a pandemic. Addie LaRue, which is a novel about stubborn hope and defiant joy and loneliness and living in the present and feels alone, and they didn't know what tomorrow was going to be. So you could say that Addie came out at a perfect moment. Did I conceive of that moment? Of course not.
Unless you didn't tell us, Victoria.
I did not.
Maybe you know.
You just never know, right? You never know. And so I think that the greatest disservice you can do as an aspiring writer is to become fixated with what's on shelves now. Be the thing that's on shelves next. Like, instead of trying to guess the trend, instead of trying to play the trend, like, be the thing that changes the trend. Be the thing that, like, becomes undeniable when it comes out. So, like, if anything, shoot for the moon in that way. Aspire to be the next trend that hasn't been done yet by being you, by being undeniably, quantifiably you.
That's great. And now I am curious about something that I actually don't know. What is like big from the beginning? Because now I feel this.
The publisher underestimated the interest in the book so severely that they sold through their print run. It wasn't very many copies. They sold through their print run before release day. And so for the first 3 weeks that A Darker Shade of Magic was on shelves, it wasn't on shelves.
Oh my God.
And I, of course, being the anxious little goblin that I am, I became convinced that by the time it came back into stock, none of the booksellers were going to remember to order it again for the bookstores, and that it was dead on arrival. So A Darker Shade of Magic was never a bestseller. A Gathering of Shadows was the first book I ever wrote that hit the New York Times list for 1 week at like spot 15. Like it just crept in there for just a little tag. But the series audience grew month over month, year over year, which is exactly what you want to have happen. And so it was not a sure thing. It was not a sure bet at all. I remember checking into the 6-month mark being like, have I failed? And my publisher was like, please be calm. Like, people are finding it. And in fact, it's one of the reasons it was so perplexing that Abbey LaRue hit shelves and did so well, so quickly. Because for me, my books, I'm used to them taking 2 to 3 to 5 years to find their audience. And then Abbey comes out and it's huge in its first year. And so I'm a really firm believer in like the best thing that you can advocate for, the only thing that you can fight for is shelf space, because your books need to be on shelf long enough for readers to find them. And that's the thing, is like so often, especially in the American market.
You in social media when you posted the end there a few days ago.
So my next novel that's coming out is actually a standalone, and it's like my next Abbey LaRue-esque standalone, I say. The funny thing is it's an exact inversion of Abbey LaRue. It's an immortality tale, but whereas Abbey was an immortality tale, hope and love, and vampires, which is not intertwined.
That's promising.
I'm very, very excited about it. And yeah, hopefully I get to reveal the actual title soon, so I can stop calling it Toxic Lesbian Vampires, but I'll probably still call it Toxic Lesbian Vampires.
Okay.
But I will say that it is the proudest I have ever been.
We are going to be waiting for that. And now I will go to Spanish for a second. Bueno, chicos, recuerden que mañana tenemos firma en Barcelona a las 5 o 7
o 6.
Bueno, pueden chequear las redes de Cumplida Editores y van a tener toda la información a las 6 de la tarde en AFNAC de la Ilia. Y el fin de semana, que también pueden encontrar toda la información en las redes de Cumplida, Victoria va a estar en la Feria Internacional de Libros de Guadalajara. Todos los tickets están vendidos, pero seguramente pasen por la feria que van a poder ver a Victoria. You will have like 600 people in Mexico waiting for you, so get ready for that.
I'm ready.